do we need to redefine sovereignty of citizens? And how do deliberative processes play a role in that? And it's, I think, in a lot of ways, the voices of people that have experience that we need in these deliberations to enable to make things clearer for the rest of us who may not get it in some ways. And so I'm wondering if you could, each of you perhaps, wrestle with that idea of sovereignty and deliberative processes a bit.
You know, even the question of sovereignty has been problematic forever. You know, is it the king, and why is the king the boss? Because God said so. You know, is it going to be divine right? Sovereignty gets shared. You know, you have power sharing after Magna Carta. Oh, now we're going to have a parliament. Oh, now we're going to bring in the commons, which wasn't the commoners; it was the commercial class. You know, that they got a piece of the sovereignty. And then we, you know, get the United States, and we have this, you know, revolution. But then we have a counter-revolution called the U.S. Constitution that says we're going to bring the old system of sovereignty back in and exclude everybody who thought that they just fought to be part of the sovereignty again. And from then on, you know, we've got a Bill of Rights that doesn't apply to anybody except for the white men with property that already had rights. And we think, that's just so inspiring. Wow, those geniuses, those founding fathers of ours, you know, and I want a blood test, and you know, and because they really were about protecting their own thing, their own piece of the sovereignty, you know, and their property is just a chip off the old sovereignty block. That's what that enclosure is, because it all used to be the king's, and it's chipped off. It's like we've got this. It's like a hologram of us in a way, but it all points back to sovereignty. And who's sovereign? Who gets to control everything? Who gets to say what the boundaries are? By the way, who gets to define the terms? And that's back to language. What do we get to call it? Because that defines what we think. When you use a certain word, it has connotations. And if you use a different one, it has different connotations. And it matters. It really matters. What does sovereignty mean? It means being the boss of all that in your own head. It doesn't mean that you have to make any particular decisions. It means you have to be free to make the decisions based on your relationship to your community, to nature, to an economy, to a culture. It means that you're not constrained. And when I say you, I mean everyone. But we don't have that. You know, everyone who thought that the Bill of Rights meant them, and if they weren't white men with property, had to fight tooth and nail to get a little piece of that protection. Whether it was white men without property, you know what they got? It was called universal manhood suffrage. It was as big as the suffragists and what they got, except for white guys. You know, white guys, they're always the bad guys these days. But white guys without property had to fight too. And they didn't get it until 1845 in Rhode Island. They had a civil war in Rhode Island over it. Nobody knows about that, right? It's not part of our remembered history, the Dorr War, right? And women, and the abolitionists, and you know, and whether it's, you know, gay rights, whether it's, well, you name it. People have to fight for it because they're not granted it. They don't have that sovereignty until they claim it, until they grab it and they say it's mine. Why is it important? You know, even if we have the commons, could we have a community that says, well, yeah, the commons, except for left-handed green-eyed people, aren't really part of it. That's me, but you know, I'm out. I'm not part of the deal. Well, so that means that inalienable rights really are important in what they mean, and it's a very, you know, kind of, it's a lot to talk about, and I'm not going to go down that path right now. But we have to decide what that really means. I've thrown away the idea that we can argue we get our sovereignty from nature and nature's God, as it said as Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence. Why? I think it's great. It sounds really cool. It's, you know, wow, it's inspiring. But I don't think it's very convincing if you're really going to try to make the case. We have to have better reasons and arguments for where does that sovereignty come from, where do these rights come from. And I think I'm comparing the two, I'm making the two at least parallel, if not identical. Because if you have those rights, you are sovereign. And when I say those rights, I know I'm not defining all of what I mean here. But if you have all the same rights as everybody else, you each are sovereign in your own right. And sovereignty in this case is limited within the commons, within the community. It's limited by the idea, the theory that says your rights are yours, but you can't violate the others. Or my dad used to say, your right to swing your arm ends where your friend's nose begins. It's that simple. That's what's sovereignty. Everything up and until you make connection with the other guy's nose.
Great, thank you. You want to comment on that?
Sovereignty is a really rich and very, very important issue, topic. And for me, sovereignty has always represented something rather subjective, that we've given a kind of subjectivity, our deepest wishes, our moral aspirations, our desires, over to a power that will protect us and protect our private property, protect our bodies, in return for us giving them our deep subjectivity. But the framework over the last few hundred years in which we put that is in terms of individuals. We've been seen as kind of an atomistic society in which it's individual decision-making, individual freedom is paramount, and sovereignty is often linked with freedom, but I think that even deeper than that, there's kind of a moral sense about it and an existential sense about it for the individual. And yet at the same time, what we've been missing and what I think our language is leading us to now is the recognition that what we've envisioned as individual sovereignty is really nested in it's a collective sovereignty that we have not expressed purely yet. Margaret Thatcher famously said there is no such thing as society. And it kind of captures the last 30 years that we've been in, the kind of real strong emphasis on Western liberalism as a heritage of individualism and not about any kind of collective body. And I think the revolution that's taking place now with food sovereignty and all the other claims to sovereignty, and who was using the word, even the word sovereignty 20 years ago? I mean, it's become resonant with people, and to reclaim it from the idea that it's a sovereign state, Washington D.C. is the sovereign, France is the sovereign, Russia is the sovereign. Well, this is about the rolling back of sovereignty, the devolution that I was talking about earlier, both to people at local levels and to greater evolution of sovereignty to international institutions that can really be more effectively engaged in managing the global commons. But we're going to get there, I think, through defining these terms only if we recognize that individual sovereignty is nested within a social whole. And then we begin to get something, because now we're expressing not only our subjectivity, we're expressing intersubjectivity. And the fact is that it's that intersubjectivity that has really been privatized, really been excluded from the recognition that has any bearing whatsoever over social policy or any meaning in society at all. There's no such thing as intersubjectivity, really, fundamentally in the outlook of public policy. It doesn't exist. And when in fact we know on a daily basis it exists. In fact, science is showing that it exists. And so what we're leading up to is more of a recognition coming from sources of our own experience of intersubjectivity, translating that into a collective sense of unity, and seeing what that really does look like when people manage their own resources. Oh, what an idea. I thought it had to be outsourced to private industry. When Garrett Hardin talked about the commons, he called it the tragedy of the commons. In his famous essay in 1968, which launched a cognitive revolution in terms of what the commons means, was absolutely wrong. Basically what he said was that the commons were inevitably failed failed commons were inevitable, because if the more herders who put their cows into the pasture, the more the cows are going to eat grass, and it's going to devastate the pasture, and therefore there's nothing to stop the commoners, the herders, from putting their cows into the pasture, because their incentives are to maximize their own self-interest, capitalism, and therefore the only solution to the commons is state intervention or government regulation. That's all that can be done. I mean, the conclusion leaves out the fact, as Eleanor Ostrom said, that the sovereignty of the people from time immemorial has shown that can't be, that there can be tragedies of the commons, but what Garrett Hardin was talking about was not a commons, it was an open access regime. Very different than a commons. He was talking about a common pool of resource, not a commons. Commons are self-organized resources. People get together, create informal norms to regulate their own resources, not outsource that regulation or to propertize it through private industry. And so it's reclaiming that sovereignty again, I think that is really fundamental.
Just one sentence, I think, here, too. I second what you're saying, that there's a such thing as, I think, a collective sovereignty of a community, which is why when we refer to the work we're doing, it's community rights. It's not individual rights, although that reflects also the rights of the members. So, and I think that's a very important evolution for us, cognitively, to move in that direction.
And I think what Ben is saying here, and what James has initiated, you guys tell me if I get this right, but to me what that means is that as we look at ourselves and on our communities, it necessarily enables us to scale up to the global level. Because if, once you get that idea of community sovereignty, and you see that if it exists for your community, well, of course it has to exist for another community. And how do we then have a way to use those rights and recognize, on up in nested form, governance levels to help manage the commons? And this is really, I think, just kind of in wrapping up, this is, to me, the big challenge of evolution of our species at this time. It is basically the big question. Are we going to revolve? Are we going to have another revolution with the Occupy Wall Street and go through the same old, liberal or post-liberal, what have you, solutions? Or are we truly going to break it open and look at what are the possibilities for us to really evolve as citizens of the world? Supporting, sure, our nation state, but at the same time, the nation states, the local places of other people. So, yeah, go ahead, Katie.
I just wanted to make a comment about, because I've got this Asperger's type of relationship with everything. You said Taoism, you said existential. I'm with you. I love it. And I think the language, to me, is, ever since I've read this book and went to a lecture from a medicine person on this, is The Absence of the Sacred. It's a book by Jerry Mender. And I have enough examples in my own life to see where my absence of the sacred is. When I stepped into my friend's flower garden because I wanted to get to the other side, and she was like, shocked. And I felt terrible, but it was my, that's how I learned. It was my experiential relationship with that. So to me, that's my language now, is that I really try and be really mindful of how I experience others, how I experience my property, which I own a little house and a nice little piece of property. I'm doing a permaculture thing, and I'm really excited about it. But I'm trying to keep my relationships that way, and that is my new language. It's really what like when I heard, not yesterday, but I heard her speak before, and I have a medicine person who's a very dear friend, and that's the language. Basically is like, wait a minute and hear it. And
You're saying the language of interconnection.
Yeah,